everybody for being here on this beautiful Saturday morning. I might have been tempted to hike outside now that the smoke is cleared, but thank you for joining me today. What I'm going to talk about today is one of the most exciting, unanticipated adventures in research that I've ever had the pleasure of completing. This has been really a fabulous research project for me. And it all started actually with a colleague of mine. You all might remember Emily Wilson, who was my curatorial assistant for my first year here. She was appointed the curator of the C.M. Russell Museum up in Great Falls several years ago. And just this summer, they produced an exhibition celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Calgary Victory Stampede, which was coordinated to celebrate the victory of the Great War. And it was accompanied, this rodeo and festive event, with an exhibition of Charlie Russell's paintings. Well, the C.M. Russell Museum endeavored to pull together that original checklist, which was an incredible feat. These paintings have been dispersed across the country. And one of the major paintings in that original show was our Russell painting of Canadian Mounties called When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance. So my colleague Emily invited us to lend the painting to the show, and we were happy to do that. And in fact, we had the painting reframed beautifully in a period frame, so when you see it back on view this fall, it will have a period appropriate frame. And after we agreed to lend the painting, she also asked that I contribute further by writing an essay for the catalog. Now, the assignment was very simple. She asked me just to write a very short essay on our painting, which I was happy to do. So it was supposed to be a short piece on the creation of the painting, the content, its ownership history, because as we'll discuss and as the title of my talk suggests, this painting has a royal provenance. But what ended up happening was that I stumbled into a thrilling research rabbit hole, and it resulted in the rediscovery of one of Russell's most important Canadian canvases. So I'm excited to share this story with you all today, but first I want to set the scene and provide a little bit of context and essentially dip into the content of that essay that I wrote on our painting. So we're going to talk about Russell's connections to Canada, his interest in Canadian subjects, his experience around that 1919 Calgary Stampede, and ultimately we'll talk about the stories of the cowboy artists' paintings and how they ended up in royal collections. So this is the painting in our collection. You all are probably very familiar with this work. When it's here in-house, it's almost always on view. It's fairly large, measuring 30 inches tall by 48 inches wide. And we're going to talk specifically about the content of this painting, but its provenance, given the fact that it was owned by Edward, Prince of Wales, is also very interesting. But let's start with Russell in Canada, and that means we're going to flip the calendar back to the summer of 1888. That's when Russell, who was a young man of 24 years old, he was trolling the borderland between Montana Territory and Canada. So what was he doing? Well, he was seeking adventure in subjects for his art. He discovered both of these things across the line, as he called it, in Canada. He was in southern Alberta. So Russell began his trip to Canada, this first trip in May of 1888, alongside two friends from Helena. They spent 16 days on the trail headed to Calgary. That was their ultimate destination. They followed well-trod paths. They sometimes sought direction from Native American guides. They crossed swollen streams on horseback and by barge, and they visited with Northwest Mounted Police at their forts. They also camped along the way. Once he was in Canada, he spent a fairly lazy summer on a ranch near High River, Alberta. He hunted, he fished, and of course he painted. But according to Russell, he really wasn't doing, quote, much of anything. He was just goofing off. He returned to Montana that September. Now, there's a lot of speculation that he actually spent the winter of 1888 in Canada, but it's not true. He spent the summer through the fall in Canada. So in all, he spent nearly 6 months in Canada. And as he once wrote, I went out north across the line and lived 6 months with the Blackfeet. That also is a bit of a stretch. He, in fact, was living in a simply appointed ranch outbuilding which was centrally located among many Indian reserves. So he visited very often with Blackfeet people and other native people, but he wasn't living among them per se. I love this image, which is Russell only 1 year after his first excursion to Canada. You can see him here as a young man, very youthful, and he's already begun to affect this posture that you'll see a lot, this cocked hip, this, hat at a rakish angle. We'll see that quite a bit. So he's got a lot of attitude, and he's had a great time in Canada. He's learned a lot. He's been inspired by it. So Russell certainly found the artistic inspiration he was seeking in Alberta. The landscape absolutely floored him. I mean, as if Montana isn't beautiful enough, as soon as you cross the border into Canada, it gets even more glorious. This was the Old West, the quote, Old West that Russell loved and that he wanted to spend his life painting. These were wide open spaces, there were ranging herds of bison, these moody skies, he just loved it. He was also inspired by the native peoples he encountered on the trail at summer camps and passing through High River on their way to and from the reserves. So again, he wasn't camping with them, but he visited with them quite a bit. Brian Dippy, who is a renowned Russell scholar, has said that during Russell's first Canadian sojourn, he discovered an empathy with Indians. And when you look at Charlie Russell's work, I think that many would agree with that statement. Harold McCracken, name we know well here, also a Russell scholar, wrote that of Russell's time in Canada, he undoubtedly had a deep and lasting influence, this time in Canada, on Russell's attitude towards Indians and their subjugation by the white men. Russell's reminiscences of Blackfoot, Blood, and Piegan peoples especially would inform many of his canvases later. So he's inspired by the landscape, the native peoples, and also the Mounties. So just a quick overview here. I was actually corrected very early on in my tenure. A gentleman from Canada asked for a revision of a label that we had up in the gallery because we were referring to When Law Deals the Edge of Chance and called the figures Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Well, the painting was painted before 1920, so they weren't yet the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So let's just go over this real quick. The Northwest Mounted Police were established in 1873, and they were charged with maintaining order in the Northwest Territories. After 1904, King Edward VII conferred upon them a new honorific title, Royal. So they became known as the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. And after 1920, when the Royal Northwest Mounted Police merged with the Dominion Police, they were called, as they still are today, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So on that first trip to Canada in 1888, Russell actually traveled for a brief time with a roving squad of Northwest Mounted Police. He would actually base some of his paintings on these first-hand experiences. For example, we know that Russell witnessed mounted police officers escorting native prisoners. He depicted this scene in one of his earliest Northwest Mounted Police canvases called Canadian Mounted Police Bringing in Red Indian Prisoners of 1888, so painted the year that he went to Canada. Russell would go on to develop lifelong associations with several Mounties, as documented in letters like these. So these are both written to Northwest Mounted Police, and Ralph Selwood Kendall is one of those, and he's illustrated there at the top, this really sweet little illustration of one of the Mounties. So from the early days, the Mounties were celebrated in popular culture for their diplomacy and daring. They still are thought of that way, I think. Illustrations like these two, neither of which were created by Russell, but they're early illustrations, they remind me of scenes from the Legends of King Arthur. These guys are very heroic. Russell's artwork featuring Northwest Mounted Police generally also, but not always, underscored these virtuous qualities. So he very often made heroes out of these policemen on horseback. Between 1888 and 1915, Russell painted 5 major canvases devoted to the subject. So that suggests how interested he was in the Mounties. The first of those was that early documentary style painting, Canadian Mounted Police bringing in Red Indian prisoners of 1888. After the 1912 Calgary Stampede, which hosted Russell's very first international exhibition, Russell was inspired to revisit the subject and created 4 more oil paintings. So during that Calgary Stampede, the Northwest Mounted Police played a major role. It was all pomp and circumstance, and it was celebrating Canadian identity, and so the Mounted Police were ubiquitous among the celebrations. So Russell would have seen them again at this time. So he created these major works. Single-Handed of 1912, Whiskey Smugglers, often called Caught with the Goods, of 1913, The Queen's Warhounds of 1914, so he's painting about 1 a year. These are major canvases of 30 by 48 and the like. And our fabulous painting, When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance, of 1915. So each year he devoted time to this particular subject. The artist's interest in Mounties is also apparent in lesser works per se, in watercolors, pen and ink drawings, and illustrated letters featuring the famed patrolman. So here's this great watercolor called the Talk Paper of 1901. A pen and ink and watercolor painting on paper called The King's Scout of 1903. This was Russell's illustration for the Victory Stampede letterhead of 1919. And another illustrated letter, this one to Ray Knight of 1924. And as per usual, we have humor infused in most of these. Russell is well known for that. So I want to look a little more closely at our particular painting, and I hope this will be interesting for you as you see this painting on view when it returns. You'll look at it perhaps in a slightly different way. So we're going to engage in some close looking here. So throughout this painting's history, it's been variously titled, which makes the job of a researcher a little challenging when it's referenced differently in the resources. But we've corralled most of those titles, and we think the cumulative list is Where Law Dulls the Edge of Chance, The Only Way to Negotiate with Thieves, Arrest of the Horse Wrestlers, The Intervention of the Law, and Hands Up, plus what we know the title to be When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance. So again, as I'm researching, I have to look for all of those titles to make sure I'm covering all references to what we know to be this painting. As I mentioned earlier, some of Russell's paintings of Mounties were based on events that he actually witnessed, but that's not the case with this painting. This is an entirely fictional scene. In it, he celebrates the heroism of Canada's mounted police force who imposed law and order in the wild Northwest. When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance is a signature, what we call storytelling picture, which Russell is well known for. Russell casts 4 characters in this drama. We have 2 Northwest Mounted Police. They're really unmistakable in their dress uniform. And 2 subjects here, suspects in plain clothes. The lawman at the left, so this figure, he stands tall in his stirrups. He holds his horse's reins taut, and he points a rifle toward the belly of his mounted foe. He wears a bullet-laden belt over his scarlet tunic. So again, that's part of this very recognizable outfit. And you can actually date images of Northwest Mounted Police by what they're wearing. You can also tell their rank and order based on the particular accoutrement on their outfit. So this second Mountie is a little bit busier here. He's disarming the suspect caught in his partner's crosshairs. He leans over his saddle to slip this pistol from the suspect's holster. And here's what I didn't actually notice when I was looking at it first. He already has a lap full of weapons. He has 3 rifles piled up on his lap, and then also a cartridge belt slung over the saddle horn. He's already disarmed this guy here. And what I love about that figure is without his cartridge belt, he is now beltless. and he's forced to hold up his trousers and his chaps with his hands. Didn't notice that at first, so he's holding them up there. And he has this furrowed brow. He looks despondently at the ground as his partner surrenders. So what instigated this mountaintop meeting? Any ideas?
Horse thieves.
Exactly. So the horses in the background, as that one of the alternate titles suggests, the horses are the cause of this meeting. What we think to be the case is that these are horse wrestlers. They've stolen horses. They're on the lam, and they've been caught in the Canadian high country by these heroic lawmen. So When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance is actually quite similar in composition to that earlier painting, Whiskey Smugglers of 1913. In both paintings, mounted officers arrest and disarm culprits on the Canadian frontier. So this is a common theme here.
Probably the same guys, they just released it.
Exactly. Yeah, they were troublemakers, drinking, stealing. They were in trouble. This is not at all original to me. This is actually speculation proposed by my colleague Brian Diffie, but I had to talk about it because I love it. So Brian Diffie, this foremost wrestle scholar, suggests that our painting, When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance, is actually humorously autobiographical. So we're looking at the figure here, the one with his holding up his pants, okay? And here he is in close-up. So what Brian suggests is that the artist possibly included himself as one of the wayward suspects. And this was based on his own experience. So back in 1888, at the time of that very first trip to Canada, Russell was actually complicit in a horse theft of sorts. He was returning to Helena with his buddies, and he was riding alongside his friend, B.J. Longgreen Stillwell. Well, Stillwell had borrowed a horse from the ranch at which they were staying in Canada, and he galloped across the border on this borrowed horse, which he had neglected to return to its owner. So, in a way, he was complicit in his own theft. In comparing Russell's self-portraits with a detail from When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance, one can appreciate, I think, the affinity between the cowboy artist. So these are known self-portraits here. And I pulled these together just to, kind of strengthen Brian's argument. So 2 known autobiographical images plus the horse thief here. I think he looks a lot like the dejected thief. So they have their Stetsons set at a rakish angle. They have shocks of dark blonde hair across these prominent brows. They all have aquiline noses. And they have their hands at their hips with their elbows splayed, which is Russell's kind of signature stance. He always stood this way in depictions of himself. The figures, I think, do bear a certain resemblance, but in any case, it's fun to speculate. So on to the provenance of this piece. Provenance meaning ownership history. It's one of my favorite things to study and uncover. I worked for a long time at an art title insurance firm where my sole job was to study the provenance of paintings and sculptures to help establish proper title and ownership to these works of art. So this is something I love to do. And I knew early on that this painting was said to have been owned by Edward, Prince of Wales, who would later, for a very brief time, as we know, become King Edward VIII, and after 1936, take the title of Duke of Windsor. So the painting's regal provenance can be traced to 1919, the year that the prince, seen here in the middle, that's the year that he embarked on a royal visit of Canada. During his trip, the prince attended the Saskatoon Stampede, where Russell's artwork, including our painting, When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance, was on view. Charlie and Nancy, not pictured here, met the prince, again here, in plain clothes. They met the Prince of Wales on September the 11th of that year. According to the Great Falls Daily Tribune, Russell conducted a special exhibition for the visiting diplomats. And it was then that the Prince of Wales viewed for the very first time the works of the Montana painter and expressed his admiration of the paintings in such a manner, even stating that he would like to own one of them. So that was critical. some folks heard that loud and clear. It was printed in the paper. He probably said it in person. We know that he's interested in Charlie's work. So the prince may have actually even mentioned his interest specifically in our painting, When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance. He might have particularly preferred this depiction of Mounties in action. The prince was well known to have shared Russell's admiration for Canada's iconic backcountry force. He called them marvelous and a magnificent, smart body of men. And he commented that he loved their uniforms. He, on this 1919 visit, traveled to many of their barracks and chatted with them, reviewed them, and celebrated them. And actually, the next year, in 1920, he was named honorary commandant. So again, we know of his interest. He stated it, he is living it, we know he's interested. So this trip in 1919 is really interesting, and I could give an entire talk just on that trip. We know the prince's itinerary. There are great photographs of his travels, of his time spent with Canadian citizens. But we do know specifically, and very much so, down to the date and time, that the prince visited Russell's exhibition in Saskatoon alongside a new friend, George Lane, who's pictured here. So does anyone know who George Lane is? Interesting. I didn't know either before this, so I will explain. George Lane, if we were Canadian, we would. He was one of the big four cattlemen who sponsored the 1912 and 1919 Calgary Stampedes. So this guy is beyond wealthy. He's able to support almost, in a major way, these stampedes. So George Lane is a big deal. Lane had hosted the prince at his Bar U ranch. This is in Alberta. He'd hosted him for several days ahead of the Saskatoon Stampede, and he'd shown the prince a grand time. The prince hunted, he fished, he played cowboy. He was introduced to Lane's impressive stock raising enterprise. So this guy was a cattleman. And that interested the prince greatly, because another thing I didn't know about the prince is that he was engaged in cattle breeding in England. That was one of his major pastimes. Not like he needed the income from that business, but he was very interested in breeding cattle. So on many levels, the prince is engaged with George Lane. The prince was so enamored of the area, this Alberta countryside, that he purchased a property adjoining George Lane's Bar U ranch, which he would thereafter call the EP Ranch, or Edward Prince Ranch. His investment was very well received by his new neighbors. They presumed he would visit his Canadian estate regularly, that he would contribute to the region's growing stock raising enterprise, and he would hire local help. So they are thrilled that the prince has invested in their neighborhood. Ultimately, the Big Four, led by George Lane and the prince's new neighbors of High River, Alberta, they decided they really wanted to illustrate their appreciation for the prince's purchase of the EP Ranch. And how do you show your appreciation for a prince? That's challenging. But they thought, gosh, he mentioned his interest in Russell. We know he loves North Canadian Mounted Police. Let's give him a Russell painting. And they decided to gift him When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance. This gift presentation is said to have taken place at a celebratory event on October the 10th or 11th, so about a month after the prince saw the painting in Saskatoon. There exist several accounts of the gift of When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance to Edward, Prince of Wales. And as a researcher, this was a lot to sort through and difficult to parse fact from fiction. So this is where I spent a lot of my time. As one can imagine, anything to do with the royal family is going to get a lot of press, and some of it will be sensationalized. Russell was pretty well a celebrity at this point too, so again, you have these two figures whose histories become intertwined. Things get a little interesting in the press. So some accounts, like these, stated incorrectly that the Prince of Wales was not gifted the painting, but instead that he purchased it. So he pays $10,000, which was a very handsome sum, for a Russell painting. Prince of Wales buys, they're calling Russell a Californian, which he would be dismayed about, I'm sure, even though he had a place in California, buys the Californian's painting. So this suggestion is likely apocryphal because these are published in 1923. But again, I have to look at everything to make sure I know the facts. So I scoured the extant archival material, and Brian Dippy, the Russell scholar, and I, along with other Russell scholars, are assured that the painting was actually gifted to the prince. George Lane, one of those big four cattlemen, he had picked up the prince's painting, Our When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance, from Russell's log cabin studio in Great Falls following the Saskatoon Stampede. So Saskatoon Stampede, the painting is on view there, goes back to Russell's studio. George Lane travels down to Great Falls to pick it up and return it to Canada to gift it to the prince. Here's where the beginning of my research rabbit hole opened up. He also retrieved another painting at that time from Russell. A painting that the Calgary Stampede that George Lane and his buddies had commissioned as a gift for the prince's great uncle, Arthur, the Duke of Connaught. So this other painting was to be entrusted to the prince to convey back to England. So the prince is gifted one painting, he's given another painting to take back to his great uncle. The Big Four had met and befriended this guy, the Duke of Connaught, when he served as Governor General of Canada from 1911 to 1916. So both the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Connaught had strong connections to Canada. Canadian citizens wanted to honor that. So at the 1912 Stampede, the Duke and his family actually participated in the opening ceremonies of the concurrent art exhibition, and that's when he first encountered Russell's artwork too. The painting that George Lane had selected as a gift for the Duke of Connaught had until very recently was thought to be this watercolor, which is beautiful. And look at the size. This thing is 37 by 34 inches. This is huge. This is now in the Gilcrease Museum's collection in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which, if you all haven't been, you have to go. It's one of the best museums of Western art in the world. So everybody thought this was the painting that George Lane gave to the Duke of Connaught. It's a stunning watercolor. It's dated 1910. But this is where nagging questions began to surface for me. I was wondering why they would give the Duke a watercolor and the Prince an oil painting, even at this size. I was also wondering why, if this watercolor was given to the Duke, why did it end up back in the States as early as 1927, less than a decade after it was gifted? So things were not really adding up for me. But we'll circle back to those particular questions. Back to the Prince of Wales. So the Prince's royal visit concluded in November of 1919. On December the 7th, the Great Falls Daily Tribune reviewed an exhibition of Russell's works at the Minneapolis Institute of the Arts, noting that the show's checklist would, quote, fail to carry two of his latest paintings for reasons that both of them are now on the opposite side of the Atlantic, occupying positions upon the walls of royalty. So we're corroborated that two paintings are in England. One of these paintings, When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance, is now at the palace of the reigning house of Great Britain, it having been presented to the prince during his recent visit to Canada. So again, more corroboration that this was a gift, not a purchase. While the other, When a Left Handshake is the Safest, is possessed by the Duke of Connaught. So we just looked at a painting called A Doubtful Handshake, and they're referencing a painting called When a Left Handshake is the Safest. Just keep that in mind. Most sources corroborate the Tribune's report that the prince took both paintings back with him to England by steamer. So again, based on extant archival materials, we're assured that the prince returned to England with two Russell paintings, one for himself and one for his great uncle. Upon receipt of his great uncle's gift, the Duke of Connaught wrote a letter to George Lane, the gifter. He expressed his appreciation for this, quote, excellent and very characteristic picture of the early days when the cowman and the Indian were hostile to one another. He relayed his plan to hang the painting in his home, Clarence House in London, where he wrote, "It will remind me ever of the kind donors." The prince may have hung When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance at Buckingham Palace, as the Tribune had suggested, but The painting's tenure there, we know, was short-lived, if it was ever on view there. As early as April of 1920, the painting was placed on loan at the Imperial Institute, which no longer exists. The director, Wyndham Dunstan of the Imperial Institute, he corresponded with Russell in May of 1920 regarding When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance, reporting that the painting had attracted considerable attention during its 2 months on view. So what I'm showing you here are examples of the archival sources that I'm looking at when I'm researching paintings. These are all over the place. Thankfully, Gilcrease Museum has digitized many of these. And honestly, these days, internet searching can do a lot for you because so much is digitized. But very often you have to dig a little further than that, looking at archives like the American Archives in DC, and Gilcrease's archives, and our own McCracken Research Library. Here's another one. I was looking at this letter from Charlie's wife, Nancy. This letter confirms that both the prince's and the duke's paintings remained in England in 1924. She wrote, quote, regarding Russell picture owners in England, among them are His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, who I know has one called When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance. The Duke of Connaught has one, the title of which is A Doubtful Handshake. So we're back to A Doubtful Handshake. It's possible that later, during the infamous abdication crisis of 1936, Edward may have brought his painting, When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance, with him to France, where he established a home with his new wife, Wallis Simpson. In 1936, at the time of the abdication, the painting entered the Duke's private collection. So at one point I was wondering, gosh, if this painting was in the royal collection and now it's in our collection, is that a clean transfer of ownership? Is that allowed? But as it happens, the prince retained ownership of things like the EP Ranch, his ranch in Canada, personal property gifted to him like the painting. So it was his to then give, sell, show, whatever he wanted to do. So as the Duke of Windsor, once he was no longer the king, he retained ownership of real estate and personal property. And sometime between 1948 and 1959, the prince elected to sell When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance. The painting was consigned with Finley Gallery in New York, and it was purchased in 1959 by William E. Weiss, a Russell enthusiast with connections to Cody. Bill Weiss, son of William E. Weiss, is on my board now, will assume board chairmanship this September, this month. So William E. Weiss, the elder, subsequently lent the painting to the center in 1976 and then generously donated it in 1978. So it's been ours since that time. So there is a Finley Gallery in Paris, which would make sense. So maybe Edward worked with Finley Galleries in Paris trying to sell this painting, and that particular campus of Finley Gallery said, this painting is not going to sell in Paris, but I'll tell you what, it'll sell like hotcakes in New York. So they transferred it across the Atlantic to a New York gallery where it sold promptly to one of the top Russell collectors at the time and our benefactor, William E. Weiss. So though eventually the prince parted with the painting, when he became the Duke of Windsor, he enjoyed at least 3 decades of ownership of this particular incredible work. And that's where this story should end. And that's where my assignment, as expected by the C.M. Russell Museum, that's where I should have closed the book, but I couldn't help myself. This is not the end of the story. It's certainly not the end of the story because of Google. So I had scoured the center's research files. I'd examined the work in person for hours. I had perused, as we saw, many primary sources and reviewed a stack of books borrowed from the McCracken Research Library. But at the very end of all this, I just thought, why don't I Google the title of our painting? And maybe I'll find newly digitized reference material. As I mentioned, there's so much of it now. Or maybe recent opinions on the painting. Okay. So I typed into Google, When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance, Charlie Russell. Instead of finding what I had hoped to find, what I found, one of the first search results was a listing for a painting titled When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance at the Royal Collection Trust in London, England. So I paused for a second before proceeding. I was really kind of nervous. I'm thinking, had Russell created two versions of this painting? Or otherwise, what if one of the two paintings, Cody's or London's, what if one of them is inauthentic? That's a disquieting prospect. You know, there's a lot of confusion around titles, so I said, okay, I got to check this out before I get worried. But when you have two paintings, both titled the same thing by Charlie Russell, that's a little disconcerting. So I clicked on the link, and it took me to the Royal Collection Trust's online collections database. And the Royal Collection Trust comprises many thousands of objects. These are all gifts to the royal family over hundreds of years. And this particular listing listed a physical description for the painting, but it didn't have an image. So that was a bummer. So I couldn't immediately dispel my suspicions. But the description took away my initial concerns. So the description says it depicts a Native American and a white man on horseback shaking hands amidst a prairie landscape. That is not what When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance shows. But we still have this issue with the title. And then the Provenance stated that that painting of this subject was once owned by the Prince of Wales. So there are two things that are the same, one thing that's definitely not. So probably much to the Royal Collections Trust's chagrin, I started emailing them almost daily. I was in very close touch, and we have ended up being great colleagues and good friends, but I had to find out more now that I had uncovered this bit of evidence. So I was quite confident that our painting was titled correctly. My research, as we looked at, showed repeated citations of When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance as a Charlie Russell painting depicting Mounties arresting horse thieves, given to Edward, Prince of Wales. So I felt good about that. And I had seen many images of our painting reproduced with the title. So here's one, here's another, and a third. There are many more of this. So I said, okay, our painting I'm sure has the right title. And the history of ownership is corroborated in other resources. So having securely established the center's painting's title in provenance, I was left to wonder if the Trust's painting was not only mistitled, but it was also a little-known Russell masterwork. My colleagues at the Royal Collection Trust, who I was bugging constantly, began to send me pictures of their paintings. So this is the first picture I got, which is a low-quality scan. It's been photocopied 100 times. It doesn't show us much, but what it does show us is that it's not our painting. So, okay, our painting's safe. We're good to go there. They looked and found slightly better photos. Here's one in color. And then they took new photography at my request, and the C.M. Russell Museum subsidized that project, and then conserved the painting to reveal its palette. And this is actually still quite dark. I'll show you an image of the painting now, and it's much lighter than this. But they sent me these images, and so I confirmed that I had never seen this painting before, and neither had any of the foremost Russell experts, because it wasn't listed in the Russell Catalog Raisonné. A catalog raisonné is a database in book form or online of all known paintings by a particular artist, all known works. So this project was created over years by the foremost Russell scholars, and they didn't know about this painting. So the Trust's image showed this, this painting depicting a white man on horseback extending his left hand to a mounted Native American amidst a prairie landscape. I recalled then, upon seeing these images, those many historical references to When Law Dulls the Edge of Chance. They also mentioned that Russell was given a painting to give to his great uncle, the Duke of Connaught, and the Duke's painting was repeatedly cited as when a left handshake is the safest. Now, left handshake is not a common thing, right? We almost always extend our right hand. So this is all coming together for me. And now having this image in front of me, I began to consider that this painting of a cowboy engaged in a left handshake with a native rider was the painting gifted to the Duke of Connaught. So it wasn't that Gilcrease watercolor, it was this painting. It makes sense, it's still in England. As I mentioned, according to my research, several modern historians had suggested that the painting given to the Duke of Connaught was not an oil painting, but a watercolor. But I couldn't draw the same conclusion. Things didn't add up. Gilcrease's watercolor, best known as A Doubtful Handshake, had a secure provenance in the US. That's one thing. And further, this letter from Charlie Russell's wife, Nancy, confirms that the painting given to the Duke of Connaught was, quote, in oil. And the composition is similar to a watercolor called A Doubtful Handshake. So this letter was really all I needed to confirm and connect all the dots. And it allowed me to confidently propose that the Trust's painting, when a left handshake is the safest, was that painting given to the Duke of Connaught in 1919. So Russell had reinterpreted the earlier watercolor's theme for the Duke's oil painting, this commission, amending the number of figures represented, the figure style of dress and accoutrement, and the season during which the scene takes place. So with all of this research, I had to bring it together, compose it in a way that was very clear, and deliver it to literally the Queen of England. So here I am, an art historian in Cody, Wyoming, suggesting to the Queen that she has a mistitled painting with an incorrect provenance. That took a lot of courage, but I had all the evidence I needed, and my colleagues there were very willing to believe the evidence that I had pulled together. And as it happened, I was heading to Scotland for research on a major exhibition that we will produce in 2023 on Alfred Jacob Miller, and I thought, well, if I'm in Scotland, why don't I just pop down to England, see if I can't visit this painting in person and see it in real life, because there's nothing to replace standing in front of a painting to establish its veracity, its authenticity. So this past June, I was able to visit that painting that I helped kind of rediscover in England. And I'll tell you how that trip went. So I set up the trip with my curatorial colleague, Alex, curator for the Queen. And she agreed to meet me at the Windsor train stop. So I took the train from London to Windsor, met this very smartly dressed woman at the train station. It was clear without a doubt who the curator to the Queen was waiting at the train station. We jumped in a hired car and drove a short distance to Windsor Castle, where the Queen's art conservation studio exists. We drove past armed guards and approached on a far corner of the Windsor Castle's campus, the conservation studio, which was a low-lying building. There are windows across the roof and the facade to let natural light in so the conservators can do their work. And we actually had miscommunicated somehow with the conservator, so we were locked out for a minute. But we were standing outside the windows, and here's kind of a selfie of me taking a picture. And I looked through the windows, and there I saw the painting for the first time.
Wow.
And once we finally got in, here I am standing next to the painting, so excited. It's like the most genuine smile I think I've ever had. I'm so excited. Standing next to this magnificent work of art that was unknown to Russell scholars and really to the world for years. And it was just a life-changing moment. It was one of the most exciting moments in my curatorial career. I had a chance to look closely at the painting. You'll notice that it's unframed. That's because it is in an original frame, which is magnificent, but they're conserving that too. It had really seen some damage over the years. So because of my work, they've conserved the painting, they're conserving the frame, and it will be ready for exhibition soon. But without the frame, I was able to check out the painting really closely. So you can see C.M. Russell's signature here with his classic bison skull and copyright mark. You can also see the date, 1919. So again, all of these bits of evidence are corroborating my theory. Here's a detail. I mean, this is incredible. And the painting is called When a Left Handshake is the Safest because if you look, the cowboy here is extending his left hand so he can continue to hold the reins of his horse in his right hand and then also access his rifle if the situation gets tenuous. So when a left handshake is the safest to keep my right hand at the ready. And then what I loved is that on the back of the painting, on the stretcher bar, was the title, Left Handshake is the Safest. So again, in Russell's hand. So all of this felt really good to me. It was a fabulous experience, a wonderful trip, and ultimately we'll update the catalog raisonné with this newest edition. I included this research in an essay published for the catalog that CM Russell Museum produced, and I actually have submitted a request to borrow that painting for viewing here in Cody, because it hasn't been on view in London since the 90s, and even when it was kind of in an out-of-the-way place. There, as you might expect, there's not the same appreciation for Russell in England as we have here in the heart of his West. So what I thought I would do is hang these two next to each other and help tell that story, illustrate the story of their royal provenance here in Cody, Wyoming. Now, the Queen actually confers on every single request of their collection, so I haven't heard back yet, but I anticipate hearing back from her, given my connections now to the curatorial cohort there in Windsor. And ultimately what I hope is to hang these two paintings in the Whitney together. Today these paintings are more than 4,500 miles apart, but they were jointly purchased in Montana and thereafter traveled through Canada to England. Their subjects are distinct, that is true, but they both celebrate Canada's colorful history, a theme that was beloved by the artist, by Charlie Russell, and also by the men who would eventually own them. Look at these two guys in their Western get-up. Here's the Duke of Connaught on the left and the Prince of Wales on the right. So those two paintings represented the best of Russell's work from the period, and the canvases were chosen as two of the finest offerings to give to the British royal family, who each possessed an enduring admiration for Canada and for the cowboy artist who poignantly painted the region's storied past, Charlie Russell. Thank you. Be happy to take questions.
In his body of work, I would just assume that he had oil paintings. Mm-hmm. Was he more prolific with watercolors and then even more prolific with sketches? Is that kind of the pattern of his body of work?
Not quite. He was most prolific in watercolor.
Okay, so that more than sketches.
Yes.
So the second part of that question is, do you find that he, for instance, with his watercolors, for instance, that he repeated themes or vignettes from one and transferring them to major paintings or things like that? Is that pretty common in his methodology?
Yes, I would agree with that. So he would create sketches which would inform watercolors which might inform major oil paintings. But in the case of the Gilcrease's watercolor, that was definitely, as were many of his watercolors, meant to be the final opus. He was so proficient in watercolors, loved the flexibility of the medium, and became better and better at it throughout his career. So I think he worked most in watercolor because of the cost, his facility with the medium, and the quickness with which he could create those works, which is why it's very rare to find an unknown oil, because there weren't as many as there were watercolors. Here at the center, for example, the majority of our very robust Russell collection is watercolor. And we actually can't show those as often because they are sensitive to light. So I rotate those as I can, but what I have on view is just scratching the surface of our Russell holdings, because most of those are works on paper. But he was also prolific in illustrated letters, in sketches. He must have been incredibly busy. And then fit in all of these, adventures as well. I don't know how he did it all, except by not sleeping. Not in the case.
And another one of his little tricks I've noticed sometimes some of his paintings, he seems to be very fond of placing sheds and buffalo skulls in many of his
That's a great point. So what I love about our painting is that the foreground is really this beautiful abstraction of autumnal colors. If you look up close, it's really just this fabulous mark making, and except for interrupted only by his signature, and then shed antlers, which is often the case. Very often as well, it's a bison skull. which he replicates in his signature, but then also physically in paintings too. And, we can take these as signs of, the West that was. Certainly with the bison skull, it's easier to make that connection. A time passed. Russell was committed his entire career to depicting what he called the Old West, this romantic West that he, deemed to be a closed chapter in our history, but one of the most important chapters. So he does very often include shed and skulls and bones. Yes.
I noticed in one of the slides of the newspaper, one of the newspaper articles, it said that Douglas Fairbanks had purchased one of his paintings at the same time. And I'm just wondering, how many do you think are in private collections of movie stars, of California people, of that area?
There were quite a few at the time. So he he of course called Great Falls home, but created this beautiful second home that he called Trails End in California, in Pasadena. And he was very well connected to the film industry and had great friends among actors and producers. So I do think many were within private collections. Most of those early private collections created in the early 20th to mid 20th century have now found new homes. Interestingly, generationally, there is quite a difference in interest in Russell, and so I guess for the greater good of institutions, we have been the recipients of many of those paintings with interesting provenances. But I would think that there were quite a few at once owned by famous folks in California.
I had occasion to visit, lived in California for quite a while. We went to the Geometry Museum, and they have quite a collection, at that time, had several of Russell's paintings hanging in their museum here, which would be a good place for them because it's a Western museum.
And I imagine that's exactly where you would find those Hollywood provenances. They probably gifted them to the Autry. If you all haven't been, I would definitely suggest visiting the Autry, which is, again, one of the top Western art museums around.
It's very good. Yeah.
It's interesting because it's similar in a way to the center in that it's not just Western art. They also have this incredible collection of Native American art and artifacts. They absorbed the Museum of the Southwest in LA, and they have material related to the film industry, and otherwise it's well worth a visit. It's an observatory park, so overlooking the city, and great curatorial staff too. But they do have some great Russells. But I have to say we have one of the best collections of Russells around.
Much more, but
Yeah.
but you made me think about it. I've never seen one there.
Yep, you're right. Any other questions? Yes.
What was the purchase price of that painting? What'd you say, 1959? Is it?
Of When Law Delves the Edge of Chance. So it was purchased in 1919.
Yes.
Created several years earlier, and it's actually very hard to find the purchase price. We see this $10,000 figure floating around, but I think that was inflated. So per my research, I wasn't able to find the original purchase price.
And then it sold again, you said?
Oh, yes.
In, what, 1959?
It did. And that's the year that it sold from the New York Gallery to William E. Weiss, and it sold for a fraction of its value today. The 50s were the time to buy Western American art, and if you look in the Whitney and you check out our credit lines, you'll notice that many of our paintings were donated in the 60s, following our opening in the 50s. So these collections that were created in the 50s, when you could still buy Russells affordably, were then gifted to us, and now their values are literally exponentially greater. So we're talking, yes, in the tens of thousands versus in the upper hundreds of thousands into the millions for Russells today. So it's shocking. I mean, Russell did well during his time, which is nice. Most artists don't during their lifetime, and he did really enjoy critical acclaim. I mean, he went to England himself to show works in London. He had international shows in Canada, as we know, and showed from Minneapolis to New York. So he actually did enjoy quite a bit of fame and fortune during his time, and most of that is due to his wife, Nancy, who was his major promoter. I mean, Russell was known to give away all kinds of paintings. If he liked you, he'd give you a painting, And Nancy put an end to that, except in very important situations because she just, she knew that he wasn't valuing his work like he should have. So she was his business partner in addition to his partner in life.
The museum in Great Falls is not too much. It's just in their home, really. Or maybe they've expanded it now since I was there. But
So I was there for the first time, actually giving a talk similar to the talk I gave today around this exhibition earlier this summer, and it is a small museum.
yeah.
They have the Russell home and
Yeah.
studio, which are really neat to visit, and they
Yeah.
actually were both recently conserved and recreated by major federal grants. So if you went a while ago, it's worth revisiting. But also the collection itself is larger than you might think. So they have Russell work from his entire life, and it's neat because they've displayed it chronologically, so you can see how this self-made artist who's really training himself matures in palette, especially from fairly muddy watercolors to these brilliant jewel-toned paintings. But they also have work by Russell's buddies like Philip R. Goodwin, and then work that celebrates the Glacier National Park region. So as we celebrate Yellowstone here, they celebrate Glacier. So for instance, Vinyl Rice, who's one of my favorite artists from the 1920s and thereafter, who was hired by the railway to promote Glacier National Park, he has this vast body of work celebrating Blackfeet peoples and other Indian tribes of the Northwest, and those are all, or many of those are at the Russell Museum. So it's actually more robust a collection than you might think.
They've expanded it quite a bit.
Probably
from the last-
have.
after the last time I
Yeah,
was
this
there.
was my first visit, so I don't have a comparable
Yeah,
earlier.
That's much nicer
experience.
than what I saw.
Yeah, I would visit for sure, and then head on to Glacier and pop by Lake McDonald, which inspired
Oh,
Russell as
yeah.
well, where he had his summer home. Yes.
Just curious, was Russell's family always from the Great Falls area, or were they actually from the Santa Barbara and Central Coast?
They weren't from either place, actually. They were from the Midwest. So he was from St. Louis, and as a young man in his teens, decided to head west himself. He wasn't much for school, even though his family was quite affluent, and he had really all of the opportunities one might want. But he was looking at artists like George Catlin and Carl Bodmer, others who had gone west in the 30s and shortly thereafter, and he was inspired to head west. And
Adventure artist.
exactly, and being at a port really of St. Louis, seeing everyone head off, he was inspired, and so went off as a very young man. Tried his hand at a couple of different Western careers. Was most notably a night watchman for cowboys. So he was given the task of watching the horses or cattle at night, and then he would draw during the day. And he was really almost entirely self-taught. I mean, he learned a lot from friends, especially when he started traveling to New York. But he, just began as an artist, a lay artist, really. So, but he was from St. Louis and then headed west and claimed Great Falls as his home. And he's really known as kind of the native son there, and for good reason, because he spent the majority of his life in the Judith Basin area. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, before he went to Great Falls, he of course lived in Cascade.
Mm-hmm.
That's where he married Nancy. You could actually visit
Yes.
visit their little honeymoon home, if you will.
Yes.
There, and then they eventually decided, I think more for marketing reasons than anything
to
else.
be in a hub.
Much bigger place to market his work, that they then moved to Great Falls.
Exactly. Yes.
The background of both paintings, is it Canada or Montana?
It is. It's the Canadian Rockies. Yep. And many of his Canadian paintings, you can actually identify the particular peaks. I mean, it's also quite imagined too, and grown and amplified. But those are the Canadian Rockies with snowfields and glowing pink in the sunset.
You can tell that's out there because I've been there. That's why
Yes.
you can see it.
Yeah, it was so neat for me to go up to Great Falls to give this talk because I had never been to the Judith Basin, to Charlie's, Montana, or to Alberta, and so I got to travel in those areas and then was, really reassured that his passion and knowledge of the area was true. I think Charlie's often given a bad rap by especially critics on the East Coast for hyperbolizing the West, but those of us who know the West and who have experienced sunsets that are a kaleidoscope of colors know that it wasn't a lie. You know, surely it's embellished. He has artistic license to do that, but you know, this beauty, this stunning beauty was true, and he was celebrating it on his canvases. Thank you all so much. Hope you guys have a great day.